Hi everyone, welcome back to our channel. Before you drift off, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. If you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's relax and jump into tonight's case. Story 1. An afternoon like any other. But no one knew that, within the next 30 minutes, an elementary school teacher would face something she had never dared to imagine in her life. The late afternoon sunlight spread across the Oakdale schoolyard like a light blanket, covering every step of the students. Laughter, the sound of backpacks dragging on the ground, the calls to each other all created a lively and cheerful music. Parents came to pick up their children one by one, jostling each other through the iron gate that was always open at the end of school. They greeted each other, talked briefly, and then left, holding hands with the little children who were telling them about their day at school. Teacher Maria Flores stood in the middle of that scene like an indispensable part. At 32 years old, Maria had been teaching for nearly a decade, and not a day had passed without her observing her students, not only in class, but also when she handed them back to their parents. She was tall and slim, with light brown hair tied back in a bun, a soft voice, and eyes that were always filled with concern. Maria was trusted by the parents at school and loved by the students. But today, in that seemingly peaceful moment, something went wrong. A stranger walked toward the gate in a dark leather jacket, a baseball cap covering half of his face. The face was unfamiliar, at least to Maria, but he introduced himself calmly. "I'm here to pick up Lily." Maria tilted her head slightly. Lily Chen, from 1C. The petite girl with curly hair, who ran into her mother's arms like a baby squirrel every afternoon after school. Maria glanced down at the parent verification app. The information matched. Name, photo, ID, everything was valid. But Lily didn't move. She stood a few feet away, clutching the strap of her backpack, eyes wide, face pale. There was no cheer, no rushing footsteps. There was an awkward silence. Maria leaned down and said softly, "Lily, are you okay?" The girl shook her head, very slightly. Then she whispered, just loud enough for Maria to hear, I don't want to go home." Maria's heart sank. The words, so small and heavy, sounded like alarm bells in her head. No first grader would say that at the end of the school day, unless something was seriously wrong. The man stepped forward, placing his hand on Lily's shoulder. "Come on, honey, your mother is waiting." His voice was deliberately warm, but Maria heard something else. An awkwardness, a rush, and the look no familiarity, just control. Maria pursed her lips. Maybe she was just being too sensitive. Maybe not. "Could you wait a moment?" she asked, pulling Lily closer. "We usually check against the information from the classroom." The new procedure. The man frowned, but then she nodded. As he turned away to check his phone, Maria asked Lily quietly, "Do you know who that person is?" Lily just looked at her, saying nothing, but her eyes were pleading. Maria swallowed. She couldn't stop him from picking up the girl. The school app confirmed her identity, but her intuition as a teacher who had worked in 3 states and had dealt with more than her share of troubled families told her that there was a terrible truth lurking beneath the legal facade, a truth she didn't want to believe was real. The grey SUV pulled out of the parking lot, swirling dust in the afternoon light. Lily sat inside, turning to look back at her through the window, a look that made Maria unable to stand still. She picked up her phone, locked the classroom, and climbed into her car. She didn't know what she would see. She only knew that there were silent voices that no one else could hear except Maria. And this time, she wouldn't ignore them. The grey SUV turned off campus, disappearing into the thinning traffic on Oakdale Avenue. Maria gripped the wheel, her heart pounding, her eyes fixed on the license plate ahead. She kept a comfortable distance, not close enough to be noticed, but not too far enough to lose sight of her. The sun was setting behind the trees, the warm yellow light starting to fade into the hazy orange of twilight, bathing the town in an indescribable gloom. She had never done this before. Maria wasn't a private eye. She was just an elementary school educator who usually spent her evenings grading papers, filling out grade books, and reviewing activities for the next day's class. But today, every sense was on alert, and Lily, the girl with the frightened eyes, was still in the SUV. The car turned left, then right, not toward the residential west side, where Maria knew Lily lived with her mother. Instead, it sped away from downtown into the northern suburbs, where the houses were sparse and the streetlights weren't even on. Maria frowned. She'd been teaching in Oakdale long enough to know this road didn't lead to any residential areas. As she drove farther, the scenery changed. The familiar little coffee shops, bookstores, and bakeries disappeared. Instead, there were fields of tall grass, trees growing thickly along the sidewalks, and old houses, some with faded for sale signs. It was like being transported into another world. A world that was quiet, forlorn, and strange. Maria stepped on the gas lightly as the SUV slowed. Her heart clenched as she realized where she was going. A narrow gravel path led deep into a clearing between tall trees. At the end of the path, a 2-story wooden house appeared. Paint peeling, windows broken, the porch tilted to one side as if a strong wind could knock it down. Each window frame looked like the blind eyes of a creature that had been asleep for years. Maria parked about 200 meters away, behind a low bush, turned off the engine, turned off the lights, stopped breathing for a second. The SUV stopped in front of the porch. The man stepped out, the faint light from the phone in his hand illuminating his face, hard, rough, and inhuman. No longer polite or courteous, he walked round to the back seat and opened the door. Maria held her breath. Lily was pulled out, not the way a father would gently greet his daughter, but the way someone hastily hit a package. His hand gripped Lily's wrist as if he was afraid she would run away. She didn't cry or scream, just a small shadow dragging his feet and bowing his head. Grumpy, hurried, stiff. Those 3 words swirled in Maria's mind as she took in the scene. Before her, she hoped it was all a big misunderstanding. Maybe the man was Lily's relative. Maybe this was the cottage. Maybe, but her instincts didn't believe it. Maria slowly opened the car door. A cold wind blew in, carrying the musty smell of wasteland and rotting grass. She stepped out gently, following the edge of the woods, avoiding the broken branches that might make noise. When she was only 50 yards from the cottage, she hid behind a large tree trunk, its bark rough and green with mold. The dim light inside the cottage suddenly turned on. A ceiling light flickered through the rotten wooden window. Maria watched as the man dragged Lily inside, pushing her down into an old chair. For the next few seconds, Maria couldn't believe her eyes. He pulled out a roll of duct tape. She tried to back away, but not fast enough. One hand held Lily's shoulders, the other taped over her mouth. Then, with rope, he tied her hands to the chair. Maria covered her mouth, her eyes blurred. There was no sound of wind, no sound of cars, only the pounding of blood in her head. Inside the house, a 7-year-old girl was tied up like a commodity. The man pulled out his phone, dialed a number, and began to speak. Maria couldn't hear at all, but one phrase hit her like a thunderbolt. Delivery tonight. She's ready. Delivery tonight. She's ready. Maria's heart broke. This wasn't a relative, not a father. This was a trafficker, and Lily was just another commodity in that cold system. She backed away, her hands shaking so much she almost dropped the phone. She opened the camera, took a few quick photos, then switched to recording. She needed proof. She needed verification. She needed to save Lily, but most importantly, She needed to do it now, before it got completely dark, before the actual delivery happened. Maria crouched even lower, her heart pounding in her ears, every beat filled with tension and anger. She hid behind a mossy tree trunk, the distance between her and the house now less than 20 meters. The wooden door in front of her was not closed, leaving a narrow gap through which pale yellow light spilled out into the twilight. The night wind was starting to get chilly, carrying with it the dampness of earth and the rotting smell of fallen leaves. But Maria felt nothing but the shiver of adrenaline coursing through her. She carefully tiptoed until she could see the scene inside. Through the gap in the rotten wood, what Maria saw made her whole body numb. Lily was tied to an old wooden chair in the middle of the dusty room, her back arched as if trying to shrink away from the rope that was cutting into her small wrists. A strip of silver tape was tightly stuck to her mouth. Her face was wet with tears, her eyes wide open, wet and desperate. Lily's gaze accidentally caught Maria's through the gap in the door. For a moment, she blinked, as if pleading silently. Maria had to bite her lip hard to keep from sobbing. The strange man stood with his back to Lily, pressing the phone and talking evenly, as if this was just a familiar transaction. His voice was low, but each word that came through the door was enough to make Maria shiver. "She's still here. Good. No trouble. Delivered tonight, as promised. Yeah, like the one from the other day. I learned to keep Clara away from him when he was in his worst states. But that particular night, her voice trailed off, and for a moment Wright thought she might not be able to continue. But then she drew a shuddering breath and forced herself. To go on, I had gone to the market. Just for an hour, no more. When I returned, I could hear crying coming from the basement. Terrible crying, not like anything I'd ever heard before. I found her down there, in that dark, cold space, where Richard sometimes went to drink, away from my disapproving eyes. She was. Mrs. Vance's voice broke completely, and she pressed her hands to her face. She was so badly hurt, so very badly hurt. I knew immediately that she wouldn't survive. Wright felt the familiar weight of human tragedy settling over him. The particular heaviness that came with witnessing the moment when someone's carefully constructed world revealed its rotten foundations. "What did you do?" I held her. For hours, I held her while she cried and called for me to make the pain stop. I couldn't bear to leave her alone, not even to call for help that I knew would come too late. And God forgive me, I recorded it. I don't know why. Perhaps because I couldn't bear the thought of losing even her suffering, of letting any part of her disappear completely. The tape machine was down there. Richard used to listen to music while he drank, and I pressed record and held her until she was gone. The kitchen had fallen into a profound silence, broken only by the soft sound of Mrs. Vance's weeping and the relentless ticking of the clock. "And your husband?" Her eyes hardened, the grief transforming into something colder and more determined. He came home that evening as if nothing had happened, drunk, as usual, reeking of whiskey and self-pity. He found me in the kitchen, still covered in her blood. And do you know what he said? He said it was an accident, that she had fallen down the stairs, that we would tell people she had died of a sudden illness, meningitis perhaps, and no one would ask questions. But you didn't accept that. How could I? The words came out as a fierce whisper. She was 8 years old. 8, she trusted him, and he. She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. The implications hung in the air between them like a physical presence. "So you killed him?" Mrs. Vance nodded slowly. I waited until he passed out in his chair. Never took long. Then I mixed sleeping tablets into his whiskey. More than enough to ensure he would never wake up. When I was certain he was gone, I dragged him to the garden and buried him under what would become the rose bed. I've been tending his grave ever since, disguising it as something beautiful instead of the monument to evil that it really is. That afternoon, Wright made the necessary telephone calls. The process that followed was both more and less dramatic than he had expected. A careful ballet of officials and procedures, conducted with the particular solemnity that serious crimes demanded. Mrs. Vance, to her credit, repeated her confession calmly and completely to the investigating officers, adding details that painted an even more heartbreaking picture of a mother's love twisted into something terrible by grief and desperation. The investigation confirmed her story in its essential details. The remains of a man and a young girl were indeed found in the garden, beneath roses that had grown with unnatural vigor for decades. The basement revealed evidence of violence, long since cleaned, but still detectable to modern forensic techniques. Mrs. Vance's careful records the tape recordings, the doctor's reports she had forged to support the fiction of Clara's illness, even a diary she had kept detailing her husband's increasingly erratic behavior, provided a comprehensive account of the tragedy that had unfolded 36 years before. But for Wright, the most profound moment came 3 days after Mrs. Vance's arrest, when he was permitted to visit her in the small holding facility where she awaited her hearing. She seemed smaller, somehow, as if the removal of her decades-long secret had diminished her physical presence. But there was also a peace in her face that had been entirely absent during his stay at the house. "I wanted to thank you," she said, her hands folded carefully in her lap. "I know that sounds strange, but I've been carrying this alone for so very long. There's a relief in finally being able to speak about it." "What will you do now?" Wright asked. "I don't know. The lawyers tell me that the courts may be lenient, given my age and the circumstances. But honestly, I'm not sure it matters anymore. I've spent 36 years being my own jailer. Whatever punishment they decide on can hardly be worse than that." They sat in silence for a moment. To people who had seen the worst that human nature could offer, and somehow found a way to continue. "Do you regret it?" Wright asked finally. "Killing your husband?" Mrs. Vance considered this carefully. "I regret that Clara died. I regret that she suffered. I regret that I wasn't there to protect her when she needed me most. But Richard," she shook her head slowly. "No, I don't regret that. Some acts are so unforgivable that they demand an absolute response. I only regret that it took me so long to find the courage to tell the truth about what followed." That evening, Wright returned to the house one final time to collect his remaining belongings. The building felt different now, not menacing exactly, but profoundly sad, as if the weight of its secrets had settled into the very walls. He packed quickly, eager to be away from the accumulated sorrow of the place. As he carried his suitcase to the car, he paused in the garden, looking down at the disturbed earth where the police had conducted their excavation. The roses had been carefully transplanted to other areas of the yard, their roots cleaned of the soil that had nourished them for so many years. In time, new plants would be placed here, and the garden would return to something approaching normal. But for now, the bare earth served as a memorial to the complex interplay of love and violence that had shaped this place. Mrs. Vance had been simultaneously victim and perpetrator, protector and destroyer. Her crime had been born of love, but her concealment of it had been maintained through deception and the exploitation of her own daughter's suffering. Standing there in the gathering dusk, Wright reflected on the terrible weight of secrets, and the ways in which the attempt to hide the truth could become more corrupting than the truth itself. Mrs. Vance's elaborate scheme to drive away her tenants had ultimately led to the discovery she had been trying to prevent. Her fear of being discovered had made her act in ways that attracted exactly the kind of attention she had been trying to avoid. He drove away as the last light faded from the sky, leaving the house to its silence and its ghosts, whatever form they might take. "What about your daughter? You mentioned she died young. Sometimes grief can manifest in unexpected ways. Clara has been gone for 35 years, Mrs. Vance said sharply. I hardly think she's relevant to the current situation. But Wright had seen enough fear in his career to recognize it in all its forms, and Mrs. Vance was deeply, genuinely frightened. Not of supernatural phenomena, he suspected, but of something far more earthly and immediate. The question was what she was trying so desperately to protect. Over the next several days, he began to pay closer attention to the house itself, noting details that had escaped his initial inspection. The observations accumulated slowly, each one innocuous on its own, but collectively painting a picture that troubled him. The garden, for instance, showed signs of careful but unusual maintenance. Certain areas had been dug and replanted repeatedly, creating patches where the soil was noticeably richer and darker than elsewhere. The rose bushes, which Mrs. Vance tended with particular devotion, grew with an almost unnatural vigor there, roots clearly drawing nourishment from something more substantial than ordinary compost. The basement door, he noticed, was kept locked. Not unusual in itself, but odd in a house where Mrs. Vance seemed to have nothing else to hide. She carried the key with her always, attached to a chain around her neck, and he had observed her checking the lock multiple times each day with the nervous attention of someone guarding something precious. Most telling of all were the family photographs that lined the hallway. At first glance, they appeared to be a normal collection of family memories, wedding pictures, holiday celebrations, the gradual progression of a marriage through its various stages. But closer examination revealed gaps in the display, spaces where pictures had been removed, leaving slight variations in the wallpapers fading that suggested recent changes. Whatever images had once occupied those spaces, Mrs. Vance had deemed them too dangerous to leave in view. The last tape was the one that had been played the previous night. Wright examined it more closely and found that it contained not children's songs or laughter, but the heartbreaking sounds of a sick child's distress. Mrs. Vance had been playing recordings of her daughters suffering to drive away her tenants. But why? The answer came to him gradually, pieced together from small observations, accumulated over his days in the house. Mrs. Vance's nervousness when he expressed interest in staying longer, her apparent disappointment when he wasn't frightened. By the crying, her careful questions about his sleeping habits, and his reaction to unusual sounds. She wanted her tenants to leave. The question was what she was trying to hide. Wright had spent too many years investigating human behavior to ignore the pattern. People who deliberately drove others away were usually protecting something. In his experience, that something was often more serious than they wanted to admit. He began to pay closer attention to the house itself, noting details that had escaped his initial inspection. The garden showed signs of recent disturbance, areas where the soil had been turned, plants that had been moved or replaced. The basement door was kept locked, unusual in a house where Mrs. Vance seemed to have nothing to hide. Most tellingly, there were gaps in the family photographs that lined the hallway, spaces where pictures had been removed, leaving slight variations in the wallpapers fading that suggested recent changes. On his 6th night in the house, Wright decided to forego his usual retirement to his room. Instead, he positioned himself in the ground floor hallway, where he could observe Mrs. Vance's movements without being detected. He had learned patience during his years of surveillance work, and he was prepared to wait as long as necessary. Mrs. Vance emerged from her bedroom at precisely 11:30, moving with the careful stealth of someone who believed herself unobserved. She carried a small tape player and made her way to the sitting room, where she positioned the device and set it to play. Then, instead of returning to her room, she remained in the hallway, listening. After several minutes, she moved to the staircase and stood at its base, her head tilted upward, as if waiting for some response from the upper floor. Her posture was tense, expectant. She remained there throughout the duration of the recording, and when it ended, she waited several minutes more before retrieving the tape player and returning to her room. The performance was carefully orchestrated, but it was clearly a performance. Mrs. Vance was not simply playing her daughter's recordings for comfort or from grief. She was using them deliberately as part of some larger strategy. The only logical explanation was that she was trying to drive him away, just as she had driven away the previous tenants. The question remained, what was she trying to protect? The answer came to him the following morning during breakfast. Mrs. Vance seemed more agitated than usual, her hands trembling as she served his eggs. Her conversation was disjointed, jumping from topic to topic with an anxiety that suggested she was reaching some kind of breaking point. "I've been thinking," she said suddenly, "that perhaps this arrangement isn't working out as well as we had hoped. I hate to suggest it, but if you're finding the house too disturbing—" "Actually," Wright said carefully, "I'm not disturbed at all. I'm finding it quite fascinating from a professional standpoint." Professional standpoint? Well, I spent nearly 4 decades investigating unusual situations. This house presents an interesting puzzle. The crying, the previous tenants, rapid departures, the general atmosphere of unease. In my experience, such phenomena usually have very earthly explanations. Mrs. Vance's face had gone pale. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "I think you do," Wright said gently. "I know about the tape recordings, Mrs. Vance. I know you've been playing them deliberately to frighten your tenants away. What I don't know is why." She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I think you should leave today. I'll return your deposit, of course. But I don't think this arrangement is suitable for either of us." "I am afraid I can't do that," Wright said. "You see, I've begun to suspect that there's more to this situation than artificial hauntings. I think you're hiding something, and I think it's serious enough that you're willing to go to considerable lengths to keep people from discovering it." Mrs. Vance's composure cracked. "You don't understand. You can't understand. I've been protecting them, all of them, the tenants who left. If they had stayed, if they had insisted on investigating, what would they have found?" She pressed her hands to her face, and for a moment Wright thought she might break down entirely. But when she looked up, her expression had hardened into something approaching resignation. Wright sat in silence for a long moment, processing the full horror of what he had just heard. "And the recordings you've been playing?" "I started taking in lodgers a few years ago, when money became tight," she said, her voice steadier now that the worst of the truth was out. "But I realized that if someone stayed long enough, they might notice things. The garden, perhaps, or they might hear." Mrs. Vance's eyes filled with fresh tears. "He won't rest, you see, Richard. Even after all these years, he's still in the house. I hear him sometimes, moving through the rooms at night, opening and closing doors. I think he's trying to tell people what I did to him, trying to lead them to the basement, where it happened, or to the garden, where he's buried." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place now, creating a picture far more complex than Wright had initially imagined. "So you play your daughters' recordings to drive people away before they can discover the real haunting." I couldn't bear the thought of strangers learning the truth about what he did to her, about what I did to him. "Those recordings, they're all I have left of her voice, but they serve a purpose. People hear them and leave quickly, before they can sense his presence, before they can be drawn to investigate places they shouldn't go." Mrs. Vance Wright said gently, "I think you need to speak with someone about this, officially." She nodded, her face streaked with tears, but somehow calmer than he had seen her since his arrival. "I know. I've known for years that this couldn't continue forever. I couldn't bear the thought of leaving Clara. She's buried in the garden, too, you see." next to him. I've been taking care of both of them all these years, making sure the roses stay beautiful for her, and keeping his grave unmarked as he deserves. You'll need to tell the authorities everything you've told me. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I suppose it's time. The confession that followed came in fragments, extracted piece by piece, like shards of glass from a wound. Mrs. Vance spoke haltingly, her voice breaking repeatedly as the words fought their way past decades of carefully maintained silence. It was 36 years ago, she began. Clara was 8. Such a beautiful child, so full of life and music. She had the most remarkable singing voice, clear as a bell, pitch perfect, even at that age. I used to record her constantly, capturing every song, every laugh, every precious sound she made. She paused, staring down at her hands, which were trembling so violently she had to clasp them together to still them. My husband, Richard, he drank. Not socially, you understand, but seriously, dangerously. As the years passed, he became unpredictable, violent sometimes. Not the irregular gasping of fresh grief, but something more measured, almost methodical. It rose and fell in waves, pausing occasionally as if the mourner were attempting to regain composure, only to begin again with renewed intensity. He rose and went to the window, but the garden was empty, the neighboring houses dark. The weeping continued, neither growing louder nor fading, but maintaining its consistent rhythm of grief. He opened his door and stepped into the hallway, but the sound seemed no clearer here. If anything, it became more elusive, as if his movement had somehow disturbed whatever mechanism was producing it. After perhaps 10 minutes, the crying stopped as abruptly as it had begun. Wright waited another quarter hour, but the house had returned to its normal collection of settling sounds, the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the subtle creaking of wood adjusting to the night's cooler temperatures. He returned to bed, but sleep eluded him. 2 tenants had left because of this same phenomenon. Whatever its source, it was real enough to be consistently reported. In his experience, multiple independent witnesses, describing the same unusual occurrence, were rarely mistaken about the basic facts, even if their interpretation of those facts might be flawed. Armed with his concrete evidence and his growing understanding of the house's hidden patterns, Wright approached the next morning's breakfast with the careful preparation of someone about to conduct a crucial interrogation. Mrs. Vance seemed to sense that something fundamental had shifted. She moved through the breakfast preparations with jerky, nervous motions, dropping the butter knife twice and spilling cream across the tablecloth. Her eyes darted repeatedly to Wright's face, as if trying to read his thoughts. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, her voice higher than usual. "I did, thank you, though I took a bit of a walk around the house during the night. Couldn't sleep initially, and I thought some exploration might tire me out." Mrs. Vance went very still. "Oh, I hope you didn't. That is, I hope you weren't disturbed by anything." "Actually, I made an interesting discovery," Wright said carefully. "I found your tape collection. The recordings of Clara." The coffee pot slipped from her hands, clattering against the counter and sending a splash of dark liquid across the white tile. She made no move to clean it up, instead gripping the counter's edge as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. "I don't know what you mean," she whispered. "I think you do. I know you've been playing those recordings deliberately, Mrs. Vance. Every night, at precisely 2:17 a.m., for exactly 12 minutes and 37 seconds. The question is why you would use your daughter's suffering to frighten people away." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, slowly, she sank into the chair across from him, her face crumpling with the weight of years. "How long have you known?" "I suspected from the beginning. The timing was too precise, too mechanical. Grief doesn't follow a schedule like that." She nodded. tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. I had to. I couldn't let anyone stay long. Enough to discover. Discover what? But she shook her head, pressing her hands to her face. You don't understand. I've been protecting them. All the tenants who left. If they had stayed, if they had insisted on investigating the real sounds. What real sounds, Mrs. Vance? The ones that come from the basement. The ones that come from the garden. The ones that would have led them to... She stopped, looking up at him with desperate eyes. I think you should leave today. I'll return your deposit, of course. But this arrangement isn't working. It can't work. I'm afraid I can't do that, Wright said gently. You see, I've noticed other things. The condition of your garden, for instance. The roses are remarkably vigorous. And that basement door you keep locked. I've seen you checking it multiple times each day. Mrs. Vance's composure cracked further. Please, please, just go. Don't ask me to tell you what you don't want to know. I think you need to tell someone, Wright said. And I think you've been carrying this burden alone for far too long. She stared at him for a long moment, and he could see the exact instant when her resistance finally collapsed. The words came out in a whisper, barely audible above the ticking of the kitchen clock. My husband didn't die of natural causes. On the 5th night, armed with his observations and growing suspicions, he decided to conduct a more thorough investigation. He prepared carefully, dressing warmly and positioning himself in the hallway well before the usual time. Armed with a flashlight and a small tape recorder he had acquired during his active years, the house around him was deeply quiet, filled with the particular silence that comes only in the small hours, when even the most persistent urban sounds have faded to whispers. When 2:17 arrived and the crying began on schedule, he was ready. Moving with the careful stealth that had served him well during decades of police work, Wright descended the stairs, step by measured step, testing each board before committing his full weight to it. The sound was clearer in the hallway, though, still maddeningly difficult to locate precisely. It seemed to emanate from the direction of the staircase, perhaps from the ground floor, drawing him deeper into the house's shadowy interior. The crying had the slightly hollow quality of a recording, he realized as he drew closer to its source. There was a subtle hiss and crackle beneath the weeping that spoke of magnetic tape, of age and repeated playing. Mrs. Vance's words from their first meeting came back to him with new significance. I used to record her on my husband's old tape machine. I've kept those recordings all these years. So, he followed the sound toward what appeared to be a small sitting room at the rear of the house, a space he had glimpsed but never entered during his stay. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, he could see the faint red glow of electronic equipment, the telltale light of a tape player in operation. The room was dark, but the crying was distinctly audible now. It had the slightly hollow quality of a recording, and as Wright listened more carefully, he began to detect the subtle hiss and crackle of tape. Mrs. Vance's words came back to him. I used to record her on my husband's old tape machine. I've kept those recordings all these years. He waited, letting the recording play through its cycle. The crying continued for perhaps 12 minutes, then stopped with the definitive click of a tape reaching its end. After that, silence. Wright retraced his steps to his room, his mind working through the implications. Mrs. Vance was deliberately playing recordings of her deceased daughter's crying, then claiming ignorance when tenants complained. The question was why? Was it simply the grief-stricken behavior of a lonely woman, or was there some more calculated purpose behind it? The next morning brought a subtle shift in Mrs. Vance's demeanor that did not escape Wright's trained observation. She seemed more brittle, somehow, as if the careful composure she maintained was requiring increasing effort to sustain. Her hands shook slightly as she poured his coffee, and there were dark circles under her eyes that had not been there previously. Most tellingly, she seemed unusually solicitous about his comfort, asking repeated questions about his sleep and his satisfaction with the accommodations. "I do hope the house isn't proving too disturbing," she said, her voice carrying an undertone of anxiety that belied her words. "I would hate to lose another tenant to these silly noises." Wright took his time with his response, studying her face as he spoke. "Actually, I'm finding the house quite restful. The sounds don't trouble me as much as they apparently troubled the others. I've always been a heavy sleeper." Something flickered in her expression, disappointment, perhaps, or a deeper concern that she was struggling to conceal. "Oh, well, I suppose that's good. Most people seem to find them quite distressing." "The crying, you mean?" Her teacup rattled against its saucer, and she set it down with hands that were no longer quite steady. "Yes, the crying. I still maintain that it's most likely the pipes, or perhaps the settling of the house's foundations. Old buildings can produce the most extraordinary sounds. In fact," Wright continued, watching her reaction carefully, "I'm rather curious about them. From a professional standpoint, I've been wondering if they might have some connection to the house's history. Sometimes old buildings retain echoes of their past inhabitants, particularly in cases where strong emotions were involved." The color drained from Mrs. Vance's face so completely that for a moment Wright wondered if she might faint. Her hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white with tension. "I don't think that's very likely," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The house has been quite ordinary in its history. Nothing dramatic or unusual has ever happened here." But her body language told a different story entirely. She was leaning away from him now, as if trying to put distance between herself and his questions. Her breathing had become shallow and rapid, and there was a fine sheen of perspiration on her forehead, despite the morning's cool temperature. The advertisement in the Daily Chronicle had been modest, almost apologetic in its brevity. "Quiet room to let in, period home. Suitable for a professional gentleman. References required. Mrs. Eleanor Vance." Below this, a telephone number in careful copperplate script, as if the very act of seeking a lodger required the formality of proper penmanship. Detective Inspector Thomas Wright, recently retired from the city constabulary after 37 years of service, had circled the advertisement with his fountain pen. The other notices: modern bedsit, all amenities, shared accommodation. Young professionals preferred held no appeal for a man who had spent his working life surrounded by the clamour of Manchester's most sordid secrets. He craved the opposite now: silence, solitude, the gentle decay of old wood and wallpaper that remembered better times. The house stood on Elm Street in Arlington, its Victorian bones still proud despite the encroachment of modern suburbia's relentless sunshine. Wright had driven out after his retirement, seeking something he could not name. Perhaps the mythical peace that was supposed to await those who had served their time in the trenches of human failing. The house, with its gabled windows and wraparound porch, seemed to promise the kind of English propriety he had not realized. He missed until he saw it transplanted here among the manicured lawns. Mrs. Eleanor Vance answered the door before his finger had fully depressed the bell. She was precisely what he had expected. A woman in her 70s, perhaps with silver hair arranged in careful waves and a cardigan that had seen better decades. Her face bore the particular pallor of someone who had spent years avoiding the sun, as if she remained in some essential way a creature of English mists. "Inspector Wright," she said, and her voice carried the same careful propriety as her handwriting. "How good of you to come, former inspector," he corrected gently. "I'm quite retired now, Mrs. Vance, of course." She stepped aside to allow him entry, and he noticed how her hand trembled slightly as she gestured toward the interior. "Please, do come in. The room is on the second floor. It has lovely morning light." The house's interior matched its exterior. promise. Dark wood paneling, Persian rugs worn thin in places, furniture that spoke of decades of careful maintenance rather than replacement. The air held the particular scent of old houses, not musty precisely, but carrying layers of time like sediment, lavender and lemon oil. The faint ghost of pipe tobacco, and something else underneath that might have been medicine or the peculiar sweetness of age itself. "I should mention," Mrs. Vance said as they climbed the stairs, her voice carefully casual, that the previous tenant left rather suddenly. "Nothing to do with the accommodations, I'm sure. People are so transient these days. No staying power." Wright made a non-committal sound. In his experience, sudden departures usually had excellent reasons behind them, though those reasons were not always immediately apparent. The room was indeed lovely, with tall windows that looked out over the garden and what appeared to be the original oak flooring, polished to a warm glow. The furniture was simple but well kept. A single bed with a patchwork quilt, a writing desk positioned to catch the light, a wardrobe that smelled faintly of cedar and lavender sachets. "Very nice," Wright said, and meant it. After years of utilitarian police accommodation, and then the sterile efficiency of his Manchester flat, the room's quiet dignity appealed to him. "I do hope you'll find it comfortable," Mrs. Vance said. The previous tenant, and the one before that, come to think of it, complained of noises in the night. Old houses, you know, they settle and creak. I've grown so accustomed to it that I hardly notice anymore. "What sort of noises?" She paused at the window, her fingers worrying the edge of the curtain. "Crying," they said. "A woman weeping. Quite ridiculous, of course. There's only myself in the house, and I'm not given to such displays." Her laugh was brief and unconvincing. I suspect they were simply not accustomed to the sounds of an older home. The pipes, perhaps, or the wind in the eaves. Wright nodded, though something in her manner suggested she was more troubled by these complaints than she wished to appear. "I am not easily disturbed, Mrs. Vance. 37 years in the city, constabulary tends to inure one to unusual sounds." Relief flickered across her features. "Oh, how wonderful. I do hope you'll be staying longer than the others. It's been quite disheartening, really. People arriving with such enthusiasm and then departing so abruptly. Makes one wonder if there's something wrong with the house itself." "I'm sure there isn't," Wright said, though he had learned long ago that houses, like people, could harbor secrets that manifested in unexpected ways. The terms were agreed upon easily enough. Rent reasonable for the area, breakfast included. Use of the sitting room and garden permitted. Mrs. Vance seemed almost pathetically grateful for his acceptance, as if she had been expecting another rejection. "I'll have the room ready for you tomorrow," she said as they returned to the front hall. "Though I should mention, I'm not a heavy sleeper. So if you hear any disturbances in the night, please don't hesitate to investigate. I would hate for you to be troubled by the same concerns as the previous tenants." An odd thing to say, Wright thought as he drove back to his hotel. Most landlords would warn against investigating strange noises, not encourage it. But perhaps Mrs. Vance was simply eager to have someone debunk whatever had frightened her previous lodgers. He moved in the following afternoon, his belongings fitting easily into the room's modest space. Mrs. Vance had prepared tea, proper tea in a china service that matched the room's quiet elegance, and they sat in the garden while the late afternoon light slanted through the oak trees. "Have you lived in the house long?" Wright asked. 43 years, she replied, her hands steady on her teacup. "My husband and I bought it when we were first married. He passed away some years ago, and I've been on my own since. The house is really too large for one person, but," she shrugged, "one becomes attached to places, doesn't one? All those memories bound up in the very walls. Children." A shadow crossed her face. "We had a daughter, Clara. She died when she was 8. Meningitis. That was 35 years ago now, but sometimes it feels like yesterday. I'm sorry, Wright said, and meant it. He had seen enough grief in his career to recognize the particular weight of a parent's loss. She had the most beautiful singing voice, Mrs. Vance continued, her gaze distant. Even as a tiny thing, she could carry a tune perfectly. I used to record her on my husband's old tape machine. Silly songs, nursery rhymes. I've kept those recordings all these years. Sometimes, when I'm feeling particularly melancholy, I play them. It's probably quite morbid, but they're all I have left of her voice. Wright nodded, understanding. The bereaved often clung to such fragments recordings, photographs, items of clothing that still carried a familiar scent. These tangible connections to the lost became sacred objects, invested with meaning that others might find difficult to comprehend. Your husband must have been a comfort during such a difficult time. Oh yes, Mrs. Vance said quickly. Yes, he was. Until he wasn't. Of course. But that's the way of things, isn't it? We're all alone in the end. That evening, Wright unpacked his belongings and arranged them in the room's orderly spaces. The ritual of settling in was familiar and comforting. Books aligned on the shelf, clothes hung in the wardrobe, his shaving kit positioned on the washstand. The room felt welcoming, despite its previous tenant's hasty departures. He retired early, tired from the day's activity and the accumulated exhaustion of his recent cross-country journey. The bed was comfortable, the sheets fresh and smelling of lavender. Outside, the night sounds of suburban Arlington filtered through. The windows, distant traffic, the rustle of leaves, the occasional bark of a dog. He was drifting towards sleep when he heard it. A sound so faint that he might have imagined it, except that his professional training had taught him to trust his senses, even in the liminal space between waking and sleeping. At first he thought it might be the wind, or perhaps the settling of the house's old timbers. But as he lay motionless in the darkness, holding his breath to listen more carefully, the sound resolved into something unmistakably human, crying. Not the harsh sobbing of acute grief, but the quiet, steady weeping of someone who had moved beyond the initial shock of loss into the deeper waters of sustained sorrow. The kind of crying that spoke of wounds that had never properly healed, of pain that had become a constant companion rather than an occasional visitor. Wright remained perfectly still, his eyes open in the darkness, every sense focused on the sound. Years of police work had taught him the importance of patient observation, of allowing a situation to reveal itself rather than rushing to conclusions. The sound seemed to come from somewhere within the house itself, not from Mrs. Vance's room, which he knew to be on the ground floor, but from some indeterminate location that made it difficult to pinpoint. It was a woman's voice, certainly, though there was something about its quality that seemed strange, as if it were coming from a great distance or being filtered through some intervening medium. The weeping had a rhythm to it, he noticed. The thought was so disorienting that I had to put my head down on the kitchen table and breathe slowly until the dizziness passed. When I looked up, my phone was ringing. Hello? Silence. Then, faintly, the sound of breathing. Hello, I said. Again, stop looking. The voice was male, quiet, with no accent I could identify. Stop asking questions. My mouth went dry. Who is this? Someone who knows what's good for you. There was something almost weary in his tone, as if he'd had this conversation many times before. You went somewhere you shouldn't have gone. Yesterday, you learned things you shouldn't know. Now you have a choice to make. I don't know what you're talking about. 2847 Maple Drive. Blue sedan with a dent in the passenger door. Third grade teacher at Crestwood Elementary. Cat named Dickens. Each detail landed like a small punch to the stomach. Should I continue? I couldn't speak. Here's how this works, he continued, his voice still that same tired monotone. You forget what you saw yesterday. You forget the phone calls, the medical records, all of it. You go back to teaching children about the water cycle and grading spelling tests, and everyone stays happy. And if I don't? The pause was brief. People disappear, Amelia. It happens every day. Especially people who ask too many questions about things that aren't their business. He didn't elaborate, didn't threaten. The simple statement somehow carried more weight than any dramatic monologue would have. Think about it. You know where to reach us when you've decided. The line went dead. I sat in my kitchen as the sun came up, trying to decide what to do. Call the police. They'd want evidence, and all I had was a mysterious phone call and a doctor's suspicions. Run. Where would I go, and how would I live? Stay, and pretend nothing had happened. That seemed impossible now. But as I sat there, watching the morning light creep across my kitchen floor, I realized something that chilled me more than the phone call. The voice on the phone had known about my conversation with Dr. Evans. He'd known I'd been to the hospital, known what we'd discussed, which meant either Dr. Evans had told him or someone else had been listening. I thought about Dr. Emily Chen, the doctor who died in a convenient car accident after asking questions. I thought about Isabella, the nurse who seemed genuinely confused by my medical records. I thought about the woman in the obituary, the one who died using my name, and I realized that whoever was behind this, they weren't just stealing identities. For insurance fraud, they were stealing lives, literally and figuratively. They were taking people, vulnerable people, people who wouldn't be missed, and using them up, discarding them when they were no longer useful. The phone rang again. This time it was Dr. Evans. Amelia, thank God, listen to me very carefully. You need to get out of your house, right now. What? Why? Because I just got a call from hospital administration. Someone reported that you were acting strangely. Yesterday, that you seemed confused and possibly dangerous. They want me to recommend you for psychiatric evaluation. The pieces clicked into place with horrible clarity. They were going to have me committed. Not committed, he said. Transferred. To a private facility that specializes in treating difficult patients. Patients who ask too many questions, who cause problems. His voice was urgent, frightened. Amelia, I think that's where they take people when they want them to disappear. Quietly, officially. You'll be receiving medical care, unofficially. I didn't need him to finish. Unofficially, I'd become one of the people who wouldn't be missed. One of the people whose bodies could be used for whatever procedures someone was willing to pay for. How long do I have? They'll probably come for you this afternoon, sometime after normal business hours, when there are fewer witnesses. You need to go now, and you need to go somewhere they won't think to look for you. I was already moving, throwing clothes into a bag, grabbing my laptop and a phone charger. What about you? I'm going to try to find the other records. The real ones. Someone here has to know where they're taking people, where they're keeping them. But, Amelia, he paused. Be careful who you trust. This thing, it goes deeper than just one hospital. There are people involved who have access to police records, medical databases, everything. They'll be able to track you if you use credit, cards, or your cell phone. After I hung up, I stood in my living room, looking around at my normal life. The stack of ungraded papers on my coffee table, Dickens sleeping in his favorite chair, the coffee cup I'd never finished that morning. It all looked so ordinary, so unthreatening. But I knew I might never see any of it again. I left through the back door, cutting through my neighbor's yard to get to my car without being seen from the street. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse of a white van parked at the end of my block, the kind that could easily be mistaken for a medical transport vehicle. I'd been right to run. For the next 3 days, I lived like a fugitive. I paid cash for everything, kept my phone turned off except for brief calls to Dr. Evans, and stayed in a cheap motel outside the city. He'd managed to access more records. He told me during one of our conversations, and what he'd found was worse than we'd imagined. The fraud ring wasn't just stealing identities for insurance billing. They were running a full-scale trafficking operation, taking vulnerable people, immigrants, runaways, addicts, anyone who wouldn't be misstand, using them for black market medical procedures, organ harvesting, experimental surgeries, procedures that legitimate doctors wouldn't perform. And when the victims died, as many of them inevitably did, their deaths were recorded under the stolen identities. People like me, people with clean records and good insurance, were unknowingly becoming the official identities of the dead. There are dozens of names, Dr. Evans told me during our last conversation, maybe hundreds, all people like you, middle class, employed, insured, and all of them have been dying in official records while continuing to live their normal lives. Until they don't, I said, thinking of the phone call, the white van, the psychiatric evaluation that was really an abduction order. Until they don't, he agreed. On the 4th day, Dr. Evans stopped answering his phone. When I finally worked up the courage to call the hospital, they told me he'd been killed in a mugging gone wrong. Shot twice in the chest in the parking garage of his apartment building. No witnesses, no suspects. I knew then that I was completely alone. I'm writing this in a public library in Savannah, using a computer that can't be traced back to me. Tomorrow, I'm going to drive south, maybe to North Carolina or Georgia. I'll find a small town where I can disappear, where I can start over with a new name and a new life. But I wanted to leave this record, this account of what happened, in case someone else gets a mysterious voicemail about a procedure they never had, in case someone else finds their identity tangled up with victims they never knew existed. The real horror isn't that monsters exist. It's that they've learned to hide in plain sight, to disguise trafficking as medical care, murder as malpractice, disappearance as treatment. They've turned our own systems against us, using our names and identities to erase others. I think about that other Amelia Hayes, the one whose obituary I found online. She was 23, which means she died young and afraid, probably not understanding what was happening to her or why. She died under my name, but she also died for my name, sacrificed so that my identity could be used to hide other crimes, other victims. And I think about all the other Amelias out there, all the other stolen identities being used to conceal trafficking and worse. How many are there? How many people are living normal lives while their names are attached to horrors they can't imagine? I used to think identity theft was about credit cards and bank accounts. I never imagined it could be about stealing your entire existence, your right to live safely in your own name. I never imagined that somewhere in the world, someone could be tortured and killed while wearing your identity like a mask. But now I know. And knowing has made me homeless, hunted, erased from my own life as surely as if I'd been the one who died on that operating table. The worst part is that I'll never know if I was successful, if this account will help anyone, or if it will simply disappear into the digital void. I'll never know if the trafficking ring was stopped, or if they just moved on to new identities, new victims, new ways of hiding their crimes in plain sight. All I know is that my name is Amelia Hayes. I'm 31 years old, and as of tomorrow, I'll be dead in every way that matters. Someone else will take my identity, my life, my right to exist in the world, and somewhere out there, in a place I'll never find, people are still being cut open under stolen names, still being discarded when they're no longer useful. The machinery of horror keeps turning, hidden behind medical forms and insurance claims. and death certificates that don't match the right corpses. This is what I learned when I got a voicemail about a biopsy I never had. Sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones who've learned to speak in the gentle, professional voices of people who are supposed to help us. Sometimes the real horror isn't what happens in the darkness, but what happens in brightly lit examination rooms, where no one thinks to ask the right questions. My name was Amelia Hayes. Remember that. If you remember anything, remember that. I existed, that I was real, that I tried to warn you. The rest is silence. Story 3. Last Thursday, I'd been at work, teaching third graders about the water cycle. But Dr. Evans spoke with such certainty, such casual familiarity with my supposed medical history, that for a moment I wondered if I was losing my mind. "What time should I come in?" I heard myself ask. "How's tomorrow at 2? I wrote it down in my planner, right between grade spelling tests and grocery store, as if scheduling follow-up surgery for an operation I'd never had was just another Tuesday errand. The next afternoon, I sat in the waiting room of Oak Ridge Health Institute, flipping through a magazine about home renovation while my palms sweated. The other patients looked genuinely sick, hollow-eyed, moving carefully, wearing the particular kind of loose clothing that accommodates bandages and tender spots. I felt like an imposter among them, which was exactly what I was. When they called my name, I followed a nurse named Isabella down a hallway that smelled like industrial disinfectant and something else. Something organic and unsettling that I couldn't place. She was young, maybe 25, with tired eyes and the kind of careful kindness that suggested she'd seen too much for her age. "Dr. Evans will be right with you," she said, settling me into an examination room. "Just need to verify a few things first. Address." I gave my real address. The little craftsman bungalow on Maple Drive that I'd bought 2 years ago with my teacher's salary and a small inheritance from my grandmother. Phone number. I rattled off my cell number, the same one Dr. Evans had called. Insurance. I hesitated. Apex Health, through the school district. Isabella frowned at her computer screen. "We have you down as Sterling. Let me just do." She clicked through several screens, her frown deepening. "That's odd. The system shows you've been a patient here for almost 2 years, but half the information doesn't match what you're telling me." "What kind of information?" She glanced toward the door and then leaned closer. "Employment history, for one thing. We have you listed as working at about 6 different places over the past year, and your emergency contact keeps changing." She turned the screen toward me. "Look at this." I stared at the medical record, my medical record, with my name at the top and my photo. Where had they gotten my photo? In the corner, but the employment history read like someone else's life entirely. Restaurant server, retail associate, hotel housekeeper, home health aide, jobs I'd never held at places I'd never been. And the medical history. God, the medical history. Surgery after surgery, procedures I couldn't pronounce, medications I'd never taken. According to this file, I'd had my appendix removed twice, once in January and once in March. I'd undergone gallbladder surgery, a hysterectomy, 3 different biopsies, and something called exploratory abdominal surgery that made my skin crawl just reading about it. "This isn't right," I whispered. Isabella was watching me carefully. "Ma'am, are you feeling all right? You look pale." Before I could answer, the door opened and Dr. Evans walked in. He was younger than his voice suggested, maybe 40, with prematurely grey hair and the kind of surgical precision in his movements that suggested years of training. But his eyes looked worried. "Miss Hayes." He stopped short when he saw me, his professional smile faltering. "I'm sorry, I think there's been some confusion. You're not. You don't look like..." He glanced at Isabella, who was still holding the file with my photo clearly visible. "I don't look like what?" I asked. Dr. Evans recovered quickly, but not quickly enough. Nothing. Just, we see so many patients. Isabella, could you give us a moment? After she left, he sat down across from me and folded his hands in his lap. The worried look had intensified. Miss Hayes, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you ever been a patient at this hospital before today? No. Have you ever had any surgical procedures anywhere? Just my wisdom teeth when I was 19. He nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already suspected. Can you tell me about your insurance? Your real insurance, not what you told Isabella. I pulled out my insurance card and handed it to him. He compared it to something in my file, then looked back at me with an expression I couldn't read. Miss Hayes, I think you're in danger. The words hung in the air between us like smoke. What do you mean? Someone has been using your identity to commit insurance fraud. Extensive fraud. According to our records, you've undergone thousands of dollars worth of procedures over the past 2 years, all billed to various insurance companies. He paused. But here's the thing that really concerns me. Some of these procedures, they actually happened. My blood went cold. What do you mean, they happened? I mean, someone had surgery under your name. Multiple someones, actually. The procedures were real. The patients were real. But the identities. He shook his head. They were using stolen names, stolen insurance information. Your name, specifically, shows up in our system 17 times in the past year alone. 17 times. I thought about the employment history Isabella had shown me, all those different jobs. The people who actually had the surgery, who were they? Dr. Evans was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. I don't think they were people who could go to the police. I don't think there were people who had much choice in the matter. The full horror of it hit me then. Not just identity theft, not just insurance fraud, but something much worse. People being forced into surgery, having their bodies altered or damaged, all under my name. My name attached to their pain, their violation. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Shouldn't you be calling the police? He studied my face for a long moment. Because when you walked in here, you looked exactly like I felt 3 weeks ago when I first noticed the discrepancies. Confused, frightened, but not lying, not performing. I've been waiting for someone to show up who didn't fit their file. Someone who might actually be who they claimed to be. He rubbed his forehead. I've been carrying this alone for weeks, and I think it's been making me paranoid. But your reaction when you saw that medical record, that was real panic. The kind you can't fake. I should be, he said. But 3 weeks ago, another doctor here started asking questions about irregularities in patient records. Dr. Emily Chen. She was going to report it. He met my eyes. She died in a car accident last Tuesday. Single car, late at night, no witnesses. The room felt suddenly airless. You think someone killed her? I think Dr. Chen discovered something that someone wanted to keep quiet. And I think you coming in here today, looking nothing like the woman who's been having surgery under your name, means they're getting sloppy, which means they're probably getting desperate. What do? You go home. You act normal. You don't. Contact the police. Not yet. Not until we figure out how deep this goes. He pulled out a business card and wrote something on the back. This is my personal number. If anything strange happens, anything at all, you call me immediately. I took the card, my hands shaking slightly. Dr. Evans, the woman who's been having surgery under my name. What does she look like? He was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. Then, young, very young, dark hair, brown eyes. Thin, too thin, she looked. He paused, searching for the right words. She looked like someone who'd learned not to ask questions. I drove home in a daze, Dr. Evans's words echoing in my head. The late afternoon sun slanted through my windshield, turning the world golden and normal, but I felt disconnected from it all, as if I were watching someone else's life through glass. At home, I spread the contents of my purse across my kitchen table: driver's license, credit cards, insurance card, social security card, all the little pieces of paper that proved I was who I said I was. They looked so flimsy, suddenly so easy to duplicate. I thought about that other woman, the one with my name and my insurance information, but not my face. Where was she now? Was she still alive? And if she was, what was she being forced to endure under my identity? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, young, dark-haired, too thin, looking like someone who'd learned not to ask questions. I saw her lying on an operating table, while someone in scrubs called her by my name. I saw her waking up in pain, confused, not understanding what had been done to her or why. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, I gave up on sleep and made coffee. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, searching online for any mention of Oak Ridge Health Institute and insurance. Fraud, I found nothing. But then, I wasn't sure what I was looking for. What I did find when I searched for my own name was unsettling in a different way. There were more Amelia Hayses than I'd expected. Several on social media, a few in professional directories, one who'd been arrested for shoplifting in Texas. But one entry made my breath catch. An obituary from a local funeral home, dated 6 months ago. Amelia Marie Hayes, 23, passed away unexpectedly on March 15th after a brief illness. She is survived by... The details were sparse, but the photo showed a young woman with dark hair and brown eyes, who looked exactly like Dr. Evans's description. I stared at the screen until my eyes watered, trying to process what I was seeing. Someone had died using my name. Someone had been buried under my name. But I was still here, still alive, still very much Amelia Hayes. Unless I wasn't. Unless the person in the obituary was the real Amelia Hayes, and I was the imposter. At the end of the week, Sarah called David to the press office. The article was finished, with the headline, "Dark in Neon. A father exposes child exploitation network in Metropolis." Sarah said the article would be published Monday morning, with the video edited to protect the victims' identities. She contacted a child welfare organization to get legal help for Chloe and the other girls. She looked at David with respect, saying he had done what many would not dare. David returned home, both relieved and heavy-hearted. He knew going public might invite retaliation from Victor and Alex, but he had no choice. The night before the article ran, he sat with Chloe in her hospital room. She was feeling better, though still weak. Chloe asked him, worried, what he was doing with the videos. David held her hand and said he was giving them to someone who would help them, and no one would hurt her again. Chloe bowed her head, tears streaming down her face, saying she was afraid people would find out. David stroked her hair and promised to be there for her. On Monday morning, Sarah's article made the front page of the newspaper, spreading quickly on social media. The videos, with the victims' faces blurred, showed Alex taking the money and Victor making the threats. The public was outraged. Child welfare organizations and Metropolis residents called for action. Under pressure, the Silver Creek Police Department reopened the case. Officer Jane Morris, the official who had rejected David's complaint, faced criticism for her indifference. A special investigative team was formed to investigate the velvet rope. That afternoon, police raided the bar, found evidence of illegal activity, and rescued 14 underage girls, all forced to work in harsh conditions. Victor and Alex were arrested, facing charges of child abuse and extortion. As Victor was led away, he screamed about protection rackets. but no one believed him. David, standing outside the hospital, heard the news from Ben on the phone. He felt no sense of triumph, only deep sadness for what Chloe had endured. That evening, David sat with Chloe and told her what had happened. He said they couldn't hurt her anymore. Chloe said nothing, just held his hand. In her eyes, David saw a small glimmer of light, not joy, but relief, as if a burden had been lifted. He knew the journey ahead was long, but for the first time, he believed they would get through it. 3 months after the raid on the Velvet Rope. Spring 2025 came to Metropolis, bringing warm sunshine and a gentle breeze. But for David Miller, the city was no longer home. The streets of Silver Creek, once familiar with Chloe's laughter, now reminded him of dark nights and the pain his daughter had endured. After Victor Ross and Alex Reed were arrested, David decided to leave Metropolis, find a peaceful place where he and Chloe could heal and start over. They moved to Havenwood, a small town 60 miles northwest of Metropolis, with cobblestone streets and quaint houses nestled in green hills. With money saved from selling his repair tools and support from a child welfare organization, David rented a red-roofed house overlooking a vast wheat field. The house was small, but the large windows let in morning light, and the sound of bird song replaced the din of Metropolis's honking cars. Chloe, now 14, still bore invisible scars. She was thinner, her eyes sad, but the Havenwood air helped her change. In the mornings, she sat on the porch, sketchbook in hand, sketching grassy hills, oak trees, and sometimes herself no longer the girl shivering under the neon lights, but someone learning to smile. David quit his job as an HVAC specialist, took a job as a delivery driver for a local bakery, and learned to cook to make Chloe happy. Their dinners were simple pumpkin soup, homemade bread butt, filled with warm moments of father and daughter talking about small things. One morning, David brought home 2 cups of hot chocolate. Chloe sat on the porch in a rocking chair, drawing. She asked mischievously, "What are you cooking today?" David laughed, joking that she wouldn't say no to his roast chicken anymore. Chloe laughed, a clear sound that melted David's heart. It was a laugh he had feared he would never hear again. One day, Chloe took David out into the backyard where she pulled weeds. She handed him her sketchbook and opened it to a drawing. A girl standing in the rain, her hair wet, but a tall man holding an umbrella over her, his eyes gentle. Underneath, in small handwriting, it read, "Thank you for not giving up." David looked at the drawing, his throat tightening. He held Chloe close, feeling her warmth. The drawing wasn't just a gift. It was a testament to the journey they'd made. A few weeks later, a letter from Sarah Jenkins arrived in Havenwood. The journalist wrote that Victor and Alex's case was still pending, but because of David's evidence, both faced long prison sentences. The 14 girls rescued from the Velvet Rope received psychological and legal support, and some testified against their abusers, including Maya Garcia, the sister of a waiter who had helped David. Sarah concluded the letter, "You not only saved Chloe, you changed the lives of many. Thank you for your perseverance." Chloe read the letter, her eyes filling with tears. She asked if many people had really been saved. David nodded, put his hand on her shoulder, and said she was one of them. Chloe smiled, a small but sincere smile, like sunlight through the clouds. She said nothing more, but the tight grip on her hand said it all. Dr. Laura Chen, the psychologist, stopped by Havenwood to check on Chloe from time to time. She noted that Chloe had made great strides, talking about her mother, happy days at the park, and her dream of becoming an artist. Those dreams were not lost, just folded. David listened, feeling his heart healed. He looked out into the garden, where Chloe painted a new picture house in a field with 2 figures standing side by side. their shadows merging on the ground. One evening, as the sun set, David and Chloe walked along a dirt path through a field of barley. The chirping of insects mingled with the wind blowing through the trees. Chloe stopped, looked up at the golden sky, and asked him if he regretted leaving Metropolis. David looked up at the twinkling stars and said he had left nothing behind, because he had taken with him the most precious thing, her. Chloe took his hand, and they continued walking in a silent understanding. When David got home, he hung the painting "Thank You for Not Giving Up" on the living room wall, using only masking tape. The painting, with the father holding an umbrella for his daughter, became the focal point of the room, a reminder of love and sacrifice. Every night, under the light, Chloe's words lit up like a promise that no matter the rain, he would always protect her. The story of David and Chloe is a testament to the power of family love and perseverance. When the legal system is slow and the darkness seems endless, a father refuses to give up, shining a light of hope for his daughter and others. It is a reminder that no matter how harsh the world is, as long as one person dares to stand up, hope can still bloom. Story to the voicemail arrived on a Tuesday, which later seemed significant in the way that Tuesdays always do when your life splits cleanly into before and after. I was standing in my kitchen in Charleston, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold while I stared out at the magnolia tree that never quite bloomed right, when my phone buzzed with that particular insistence that means someone wants something. From you, Miss Hayes. This is Dr. Evans from Oak Ridge Health Institute. The voice was careful, professional, but with just enough warmth to suggest genuine concern. I wanted to follow up on your biopsy results from last week. Could you give us a call when you get this? We need to discuss your options moving forward. I played it back 3 times, each repetition making the words more foreign, more impossible. The last medical appointment I'd had was a routine physical 8 months ago with Dr. Lee. My Dr. Lee, not this Dr. Evans I'd never heard of. I certainly hadn't had a biopsy. The word itself felt strange in my mouth, like speaking a language I'd never learned, but my name was right. Amelia Hayes. Even the middle initial AH matched the way I signed official documents. And somehow, Dr. Evans had my private cell phone number, the one I gave to almost no one. I should have hung up, should have marked it as spam and moved on with my day. Instead, I found myself calling back. Oak Ridge Health, this is Jennifer. Hi, I'm returning Dr. Evans's call about my biopsy results. The lie came easier than it should have. One moment, please. The hold music was something classical and soothing, the kind designed to calm pre-surgical nerves. I found myself counting the notes, a habit left over from childhood piano lessons, while my mind raced through possibilities. Identity theft. Maybe some elaborate scam. But what kind of scammer calls you about fake medical results? Miss Hayes, Dr. Evans here. Thanks for calling back so quickly. His voice carried the particular gravity doctors reserve for difficult conversations. I know this is a lot to process, but we need to schedule you for follow-up surgery as soon as possible. The margins weren't as clean as we'd hoped. I'm sorry, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Could you remind me exactly what we're dealing with here? I've been so anxious. I'm having trouble remembering the details. A pause. Paper rustling. Of course, that's completely understandable. The cervical dysplasia we removed last Thursday showed some concerning characteristics. We need to go back in and make sure we got everything. Cervical dysplasia. I'd never heard the phrase before, but it landed in my stomach like a stone. Surgery. Outside, in the drizzle, Ben explained that this was an illegal place that exploited young girls. Chloe was involuntary and could be manipulated or threatened. David was speechless, feeling like his world was falling apart. He asked about the young man on the motorbike, but Ben only said he was investigating and asked for patience. Rushing could put Chloe in danger. At home, David did not sleep. He reviewed the videos, looking for clues. A recording from the camera in Chloe's room left him speechless. In the dark, Chloe sat on the bed, listening to voice messages through her headphones, her shoulders shaking with sobs. David realized that his daughter was trapped in a web she could not escape. The next day, David went to the Silver Creek police precinct with a USB drive containing the videos. He met Officer Jane Morris, a policewoman who looked through the recordings with a cold expression. She said the videos were not enough to prove a crime and that more evidence of coercion was needed. David left the police station feeling helpless, like a rock pressing down on his chest. He punched the wall, blood seeping from his hand, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the pain in his heart. That night, David sat across from Chloe at the dining table, asking where she had gone the night before. Chloe dropped her fork, her face pale, saying she had just gone for a walk with a friend. David admitted that he had installed the camera. Chloe was stunned. Tears welled up in her eyes. Then she ran into her room and locked the door. The sound of the lock sounded like a declaration of the growing distance between father and daughter. Thomas sat alone in the dark, feeling like he was losing his daughter under the metropolis streetlights. He told himself that he would not give up, no matter what darkness he faced. After the heartbreaking confrontation with Chloe, David Miller felt like he was living in a nightmare with no way out. The small apartment in Silver Creek, metropolis, once filled with his daughter's laughter, was now filled with heavy silence. The sound of Chloe's door locking every night was a reminder that the distance between father and daughter was growing. David couldn't erase the image of Chloe at the velvet rope from his mind, her shoulders shaking as she poured drinks for strangers, her eyes vacant as if she had lost herself. He knew his daughter was trapped, but the police's helplessness and Chloe's silence made him feel like he was fighting an invisible ghost. David continued to work with Ben Carter, a private investigator with a piercing gaze. Ben dug deeper into the velvet rope and identified the young man on the motorcycle, Alex Reed, 19, who had been arrested for fraud in a neighboring state, but released thanks to a good attorney. Ben revealed that Alex targeted vulnerable girls, like Chloe, exploiting the pain of losing their mother to manipulate them. He gave David a file with photos of Alex hanging around the school. Looking at the photos, David felt anger flare up, but he held back, knowing that emotions wouldn't solve the problem. Chloe became more and more withdrawn. She went to school like a shadow, came home, and closed her door immediately. David noticed that she ate less. Her hands shook when holding a spoon, and new bruises appeared on her wrists, even though she always covered them with long-sleeved shirts. One evening, he knocked on her door, but was met with silence. David stood there, his hand on the doorknob, his heart heavy. He wanted to break down the door, hug his daughter, and promise to protect her, but the fear of hurting her more made him hesitate. Then, one night, everything fell apart. Around 3 a.m., David woke up with a strange feeling. He opened the camera app and saw that Chloe's room was empty. A small sound, like running water, came from the bathroom. David walked quickly down the hallway, his heart pounding. The bathroom door was ajar, a faint yellow light streaming in. He pushed the door open and froze. Chloe sat on the floor, her shirt soaked, her hair matted. Water from the sink overflowed, mixing with blood from a deep cut on her left wrist. Her eyes were blurry, as if she had given up all hope. David rushed over, holding her, wrapping a towel around the cut his hands. Shaking uncontrollably, Chloe mumbled weakly that she couldn't take it anymore. David picked her up, blood staining his shirt, and ran down the stairs, screaming for help. Sam Jones, a neighbor who used to work as a security officer, heard and drove them to Hopewell Hospital. In the car, David held Chloe tightly, repeating that she would be okay. At the hospital, Physicians treated the wound. Dr. Emily White, a female physician, said the cut was deep but not life-threatening. However, she warned that the old scars on Chloe's right wrist showed that this was not the first time she had harmed herself. She recommended intensive psychological care. David nodded, feeling like a machine, unable to handle the pain that was taking over. Dr. Laura Chen, a psychologist, met with David later. She listened to him talk about the velvet rope, about Alex, and about what Chloe might be going through. Dr. Chen took careful notes, determining that Chloe was suffering from severe psychological trauma. She advised David to continue collecting evidence to stop the perpetrators while creating a safe space for Chloe to share. Her words were like a spark, spurring David to action. After Chloe stabilized, David returned to work with Ben. He began secretly recording audio and video at the Velvet Rope using Ben's button camera. Those nights, he disguised himself as a customer, sat in a dark corner, and watched Chloe and the other girls work under dim lighting. He recorded Alex receiving money from Victor Ross, the bar owner. Victor, with a cold smile, talked about controlling the girls. Each video cut David's heart, but he knew it was the key to saving his daughter. One night, David came home from the bar and found Chloe sitting in her room, clutching her sketchbook. She mumbled that if she told anyone, everyone would know, and she didn't want that. David sat next to her, gently placing his hand on her shoulder, insisting that no one was allowed to hurt her. Chloe bowed her head, tears falling onto the page. She admitted to being threatened with a video, but didn't go into detail, only saying that she was afraid it would destroy everything. David left the room, his heart clenched. He watched the recordings from the Velvet Rope again. A voice rang. Out cold. Alex boasting about manipulating Chloe, making her believe she was helping him. David clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He knew that to save Chloe, he had to break this network, no matter the cost. Under the cloudy metropolis sky, he promised himself that he would not stop until his daughter was free. The image of Chloe sitting on the bathroom floor, her blood mixed with water, haunted David Miller every night. After that horrific event, he felt like time passed in a thick fog. Out at Hopewell Hospital in Metropolis, Chloe received medical care and began therapy sessions with Dr. Laura Chen, but she remained withdrawn, her eyes vacant, as if she were not ready to face the past. David, exhausted as he was, refused to let himself fall. He knew that to save his daughter and the other girls from the Velvet Rope, he had to act quickly and decisively. David continued to work with Ben Carter, the private investigator who had become an indispensable ally. Ben provided more information about Victor Ross, the bar owner, a well-connected man who was not afraid to use threats to silence his rivals. Both the videos and audio recordings David had collected showed how Victor and Alex Reed manipulated young women. But Ben warned that the evidence alone was not enough to compel the authorities to act. A bigger push was needed, something that would get the public's attention. The idea to bring the case to light came from David's old friend, Leo Sanchez. Leo introduced Sarah Jenkins, an investigative journalist who had exposed a scandal in a different city. David met Sarah at a coffee shop in Riverside, carrying 3 USB sticks containing videos, audio recordings, and detailed notes about what he witnessed. Sarah, a woman in her 40s, with short hair and piercing eyes, scanned the documents in silence. As the first video played, a shaky image of Chloe pouring drinks in a bar appeared, and Sarah frowned. She said the evidence was strong, but going public would put David and Chloe under great pressure, possibly smearing or threatening them. David clasped his hands, his eyes steady. He was not afraid of danger. All he wanted was to protect Chloe and stop people like Victor and Alex from hurting others. Sarah agreed to prepare an article, promising to put the story on the front page. of the independent newspaper she worked for. She needed time to verify and protect Chloe's identity, but promised to go public with the truth. In the meantime, David spent more time at the hospital with Chloe. She began to talk more in therapy sessions, although she still hesitated when mentioning the velvet rope. One afternoon, David brought Chloe's favorite box of cookies. She suddenly opened her sketchbook and showed him a picture. A girl standing in the rain, her eyes sad, but a tall man holding an umbrella for her. Chloe whispered that it was him. David hugged his daughter, his heart both aching and warm. For the first time in months, he saw hope in her eyes. Meanwhile, David and Ben continued to gather evidence. One night at the Velvet Rope, David recorded a pivotal conversation between Victor and Alex, in which Victor admitted to using video to threaten the girls, saying that no one would believe a child. David, sitting in a dark corner with a button camera, felt his blood boil, but he kept his cool. Each recording was a step toward bringing down those who had pushed Chloe into the shadows. But what made Maria choke up wasn't her appearance. It was her smile, bright, real, and for the first time in a long time, no longer trembling. Lily ran toward her, stopped, and raised her head. "I'm here," she said, a small but powerful affirmation. Maria knelt down and hugged her. There was no need to ask, "Are you okay?" The light in Lily's eyes said it all. She was in the right place, in the right arms, at the right time. And she had returned from a place no one should ever be taken to. Maria had continued teaching since that day. She hadn't changed much. Still the gentle educator with the soft voice, still patiently explaining difficult math problems or comforting. A child who had fallen, but what had really changed wasn't on the outside. It was in her eyes. Those eyes, which had once witnessed a child almost being silently pulled from this world, now no longer missed any signals. An unusual bow of the head, a child suddenly quiet, a hand shaking slightly when called by name. Maria learned to listen not just with her ears, but with her intuition, something that had once saved a life. The story of her and Lily quickly spread through the community, not as loudly as it had in the media, but enough for schools around Oakdale to review their entire parent identification process. Electronic systems were upgraded, layers of protection added. Supervisors and educators were trained to recognize the signs of irregularities. Each of us became a more vigilant link in the child safety net. No one called it a miracle, but everyone was grateful that tragedy had not occurred. And Maria, she didn't call herself anything. She didn't need titles. But one Friday afternoon, at a closed-door parent-educator conference at school, a mother stood up and said, choking back tears, "Ms. Flores is more than a teacher. She is a light for children." In the dark, after that day, that name spread, the Light Keeper, not because she was extraordinary, but because she saw what others didn't want to see, believed what others didn't dare to believe, and acted when others hesitated. At the end of the school year, Lily wrote a little letter and left it in her teacher's mailbox. "Dear Maria, thank you for listening to me. Even though I couldn't speak, now I can. I promise to always speak so that no one will be afraid like I was. And if I see anyone who can't speak, I will listen for them, like you did for me." Maria kept that letter forever. She knew that the world doesn't change with a single action, but a single, momentary action, like a bowed head, a decision to follow. A whisper of comfort can become a small flame, and those flames, in the darkness, are what keep hope alive. Maria was still seen every day in Oakdale, with her report card, her little flowered tie, her gentle smile. But after that night, whenever her eyes fell on a child in the crowded schoolyard, everyone knew no one would disappear into silence anymore, because there was someone who had learned to hear the whispers amid the noise. And that light is still burning. Story 2 in the winter of 2024. in Metropolis. A thick blanket of snow blanketed the suburb of Silver Creek. In a small apartment on the third floor of an old building, David Miller, a 45-year-old HVAC specialist, couldn't sleep. The cold wind whistled through the window, carrying a dry cough from the next room. "Chloe," he called softly, his voice filled with concern. There was no answer. Chloe Miller, David's 14-year-old daughter, had been a bright girl with long brown hair that was always tied back before school. Her eyes, like those of her mother, who had died in a car accident in 2020, had once lit up with joy, but now they were dull, as if the light inside her had been extinguished. David stood up and walked down the dark hallway, the streetlights casting shadows on the old wooden floors. He pushed open Chloe's door and found her curled up on the bed, facing the wall, her skin pale in the dim light. He sat down on the edge of the bed, his voice soft. Chloe nodded slightly, not turning around, whispering that she was tired from her homework. David sighed, looking at his rough hands. He had noticed a change in his daughter over the past few weeks. Chloe stopped talking about her drawings in art class, became withdrawn, ate less, and sometimes woke up in the middle of the night. He had seen bruises on her wrists, but when asked, Chloe had only smiled and said she had bumped into a desk at school. David didn't believe her. He had lost his wife, and since then, he had been both a father and a mother to Chloe. He had learned to braid her hair, cooked her favorite pasta, and always ironed her uniform. But now he felt helpless. The next morning, at a coffee shop in Glenwood, David met Leo Sanchez, an old friend from the trade school. Leo noticed that David looked exhausted and asked what was wrong. David talked about Chloe, his voice shaking, saying that he had seen signs of trouble but didn't know what to do. Leo pondered, watching the snowflakes falling outside the window, then suggested installing a camera to monitor Chloe, not to intrude, but to protect her. He knew a man, Mark Jensen, who installed security systems. David hesitated. The thought of spying on his daughter made him uncomfortable, but the fear of losing her was greater. He agreed, his heart heavy. That night, when Chloe went to her tutoring class, David took the equipment from Mark, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes. Mark instructed him to install 2 small cameras, one in the hallway leading to Chloe's room and one hidden in a light bulb in her room. David did everything carefully, full of anxiety. When Chloe returned, she ate a quick bowl of soup and closed the door. David sat in the dark living room, looking at the camera app on his phone, listening to the ticking of the clock. Then, around 2 a.m., a small sound rang out, the sound of a window opening. David opened the app and saw Chloe, wearing a black hoodie, climbing out the window onto the balcony. He held his breath, clutching his phone. Below the balcony, a young man wearing a motorcycle helmet appeared. Chloe ran down, jumped on the bike, and the two disappeared into the Metropolis night. David slumped in his chair, his hands shaking, muttering, "Where are you going, Chloe?" The fear was now real, sharp, and terrifying. He knew their lives had changed forever. In the days after the discovery from the camera, David Miller barely slept. Every night, he sat in the darkness of his apartment in Silver Creek, Metropolis, eyes glued to his phone, replaying the video of Chloe sneaking out the window and disappearing with a young man on a motorbike. The image of his daughter, small in a black hoodie, rushing into the cold night, was etched into his mind like an unhealed wound. David wondered constantly, where was Chloe going? Who was that person? Why did the girl who dreamed of becoming an artist hide such a terrifying secret from him? He reviewed old video footage and found that Chloe had left the house 22 times in the past month, often at 2 a.m., returning late in the day, staggering, but sometimes leaning against a wall. The bruises on her wrists, which he had once thought were accidental, now appeared as a sign of something bad. David felt claustrophobic, as if the small apartment was squeezing him. One morning, at a coffee shop in Glenwood, David met Leo Sanchez again. He briefly described what the cameras had recorded, his voice trembling but restrained. Leo, looking serious, suggested that they contact Ben Carter, a former law enforcement agent turned private investigator. David nodded, though he was hesitant. He didn't want to believe that Chloe was in danger, but his instincts told him to act. Ben, a thin man in his 50s, met David at a diner in Eastside. He watched the video on David's laptop, his eyes sharp. Without saying much, Ben asked for more footage from the balcony to determine the route of the motorcycle. He said it would take a week and warned David to prepare himself for the hard truth. David squeezed her hand, nodded, determined to find out, no matter how painful. In the meantime, David tried to keep things normal with Chloe. He made her breakfast of toast and eggs and asked about school. But Chloe answered briefly, avoiding his eyes. Once, when she accidentally touched her hand, Chloe flinched, pulling her sleeve up to cover a fresh bruise. David pretended not to notice, but his heart clenched. He wanted to press her, to tell the truth, but the fear of pushing her further made him hold back. The third night after meeting Ben, David got an urgent call. Ben asked him to go to the notorious Ironwood area of Metropolis. David put on a coat and cap and got into the car with Ben, who covered his face with a scarf. They followed a familiar motorbike. Under the streetlights, David recognized Chloe's figure sitting behind, hugging the driver tightly. The motorbike stopped in front of an old building with a red neon sign, the Velvet Rope. From the outside, it looked like a normal bar, but the loud music and the smell of cheap alcohol made David shiver. Ben signaled to stay calm and entered like a customer. David swallowed and pushed the door open. Inside, the air was suffocating, with cigarette smoke and orange light. Young girls, heavily made up and wearing short skirts, walked between tables, pouring drinks with forced smiles. David saw Chloe at the corner of the bar, holding a bottle of wine and pouring a glass for a middle-aged man with a hungry gaze. She bowed her head, her hair covering her face, but David noticed her trembling shoulders. The man laughed loudly, touching her hand. Chloe stepped back but did not dare to resist. David clenched his hand, wanting to rush over and pull her away, but the gaze of a big man near the bar made him stop. In the meantime, Ben signaled to leave. The stairs groaned as if they were buckling under their weight. Maria could hear the man at the foot of the stairs, taking each step quickly. She didn't need to look to know he was getting closer. The second floor was nothing but a narrow hallway, and rooms that had been uninhabited for a long time. The walls were peeling, the wooden doors were off their hinges, and the floor was stained with old water stains. Maria pushed open the door to the first room, but the rusted lock wouldn't budge. She turned, pulling Lily into the next room. It opened, a mostly empty room, with only a few planks piled in the corner and a broken window leading to the porch outside. Maria pulled Lily in, gently shutting the door, then pressed them against the wall, huddled in the shadows. His footsteps stopped in the hallway. Maria could hear his breathing, heavy, labored. He was listening. She put her hand over Lily's mouth, so scared that every muscle tensed. The seconds seemed like hours. The wood creaked underfoot. He moved closer. His hands swept along each door, pushing hard, opening each one. The door next to hers made a creaking sound on its hinges. Then footsteps entered the empty room. Then came the soft squeak of the door where the two were hiding. The gate had opened. The flashlight swept around. For a moment, the light hit Maria. She reflexively shielded Lily with her body, her eyes meeting the man's again. There was no doubt he saw them. Footsteps rang out. He lunged forward. Maria turned, grabbed Lily's hand, and pulled her toward. Broken window. The space outside was a sloping tiled roof covered with green moss and stagnant water. One slip, and she could fall from the second floor to the rocky ground below. But she had no choice. Maria helped Lily through the window first, then climbed after her. Her feet slipped on the wet moss, but her hands still held tightly to the rotten wooden frame. She screamed in her head, "Don't fall, don't fall." Inside, the man let out an angry shout, then kicked the door open. She and Lily rushed along the porch, their feet slipping on the peeling tiles. The cold air hit their faces, the wind whistling past their ears like a cruel whistle. A thick darkness enveloped the surroundings. Only the sound of his footsteps, chasing closely behind, was clear. A dry branch poked up from behind the roof, and Maria used her hand to push Lily through. But when it was her turn, the man pounced. A rough hand grabbed her shoulder and pulled her back. Maria lost her balance, slipped, and one side of her body rolled off the edge of the roof. In that moment, Lily turned around, eyes wide, clearly visible. Maria used all her strength, hooking her fingers into the edge of the roof, keeping her upper body from falling. The man lunged forward, trying to pull her back. But at that moment, the bright light from the headlights shone directly into his face. The police siren sounded again, screaming as if tearing through the night. Maria closed her eyes for a moment. From the yard below, a series of footsteps rang out, rumbling. An officer's voice shouted, short and unmistakable, "Hands down." The man raised his head, panicked, but it was too late. A police officer had climbed onto the roof from behind, aiming his flashlight and weapon at him. The man jerked away, letting go of Maria, turning to run, but only getting a few steps before he was restrained. Maria was pulled up by another officer, her body cold, her clothes dirty, but her eyes still on Lily, who was wrapped in an emergency blanket in the yard. Safe, alive, trembling, but no longer bound. She breathed out, the first time in nearly an hour. 2 officers led the man past. He was bowed, his hands cuffed behind his back, his clothes stained with blood and dirt. His ragged breathing was now just a faint background noise, no longer threatening. Maria sat down on the steps of the abandoned house. Now the flashing lights of the police cars illuminated her and Lily. The scene was chaotic, noisy, but there was something quiet and still, like it was over. Lily pulled away from the paramedics and ran to hug Maria. There were no words to say. The hug was enough. A glimmer of light broke through the thick clouds of the late night. It wasn't dawn, but it wasn't absolute darkness either. Tonight, a teacher had acted, and a child had been saved. Though the cold wind of the late night swept through the empty street as the police car took Maria and Lily to the station. The headlights were still flashing, but they no longer carried the urgency of the moment, but a different kind of light. The light of reassurance, of finality after a wild ride. Maria sat in the back seat, wrapping Lily in a blanket to keep her warm. She had stopped crying, but her shoulders still shook slightly with each breath. Her red, puffy eyes were closed, and her hair was disheveled and spread across Maria's shoulders. She stroked her hair gently, her hands still shaking slightly, as if she couldn't quite believe they'd made it through. At the Oakdale police station, a private room opened for them. Lily was checked over, and a social worker and a female police officer gently ushered her into the waiting room, carrying hot chocolate and an old teddy bear. Maria sat across from an inspector with the name tag Lieutenant Robert Vance, a man in his 50s, stern-faced but warm-eyed, who looked like he'd seen more than one case like this in his career. He set the file down on the table, not saying anything, right away. He flipped through the pages, then pushed it gently toward her. "He's not a relative of Lily's," he said, his voice even and slow. "Her biological father has been missing since she was 3. Her mother is a single mother, working the night shift at a hospital 30 miles away. She has absolutely no idea what happened this afternoon. Maria was silent. She'd guessed something, but something inside her tightened at the confirmation. "He used false identification?" she asked. Vance nodded, then pointed to the computer screen. There was a string of records from the school's parent management system. Everything looked legit, from the name to the photo to the ID number. But if you look closely, there are slight discrepancies. The birth date is off by a number. The photo is cropped unprofessionally. The email doesn't match any of the valid addresses in hospital or family records. "He knows how to get into the school's electronic system," Vance said. "We suspect he's part of a larger network. There are signs that he's done the same thing in 2 other districts, but this time, thanks to you, it was stopped in time." Maria stared at the screen, her eyes dry, but her heart aching. "She almost disappeared," she said, her voice a sigh. Vance didn't respond. He stood, handed her a bottle of water, and left the room to give her a few minutes of privacy. Maria turned to see Lily standing in the doorway, clutching her teddy bear. Her eyes were still red, but the tears had stopped. She walked slowly in, then, without a word, ran to hug Maria. In that hug was everything she had been unable to say out loud all afternoon. Her fear, her helplessness, and the only trust she had placed in an adult who believed what she could. "Not say I know you won't let me disappear," Lily whispered, her voice hoarse with exhaustion and crying. Maria held her close, feeling her chest heave with each beat. "I'm never alone," she said, trying to keep her voice even. "You always see things other people don't." Lily didn't answer. She just buried her head in Maria's chest, her little arms wrapped tightly around her waist, as if afraid that if she let go, everything would disappear. When the social worker walked in a moment later and nodded, Maria knew it was time for her to be cared for properly, in the right place. Lily was taken to the intensive care unit, where specialists would help her begin the process of recovery. But before she left, she turned, ran over, and whispered a short sentence in Maria's ear, almost to herself. "I'm not scared anymore, because I know someone sees me." Other words, simple, awkward, but echoing like affirmations for Maria's actions. Throughout the day, when the dust settled and Maria walked out of the police station, there was no siren, no hurried footsteps. There was only the quiet night of a small town that had just experienced a subterranean earthquake. Not loud, but big enough to change the way people viewed the safety of children. She looked up at the sky, where a few stars were just peeking out from behind the thin clouds. The faint but persistent light reminded her that there were small things that could guide her in the darkness. But tomorrow, Maria knew she would return to school with the same eyes, the same heart. But this time, her intuition would never be taken for granted, because there are things that if no one looks closely, evil will always find a way to hide. By a week after that fateful night, the morning sun gently bathed the Oakdale schoolyard, as if nothing had happened. The school gates opened to welcome students. Laughter rang out everywhere. Little shoes clattered on the red bricks, and warm morning greetings were exchanged as usual. But there was something different. It wasn't immediately obvious, but if one paused, one would see. The eyes were more attentive. The hugs from parents were a little tighter, and educators like Maria walked a few seconds slower to listen. Not just the words, but the silences that children often couldn't express. She stood in the same place as she had that day, by the school gates. A list of students leaving, her eyes on everyone. But this time, when a familiar figure appeared at the end of the hallway, her heart sank. She was wearing the turquoise sweater. Her mother had mentioned in her year-end file her hair was combed back, tied with a pale yellow ribbon, like the one from the other day. The words were like a cold hook that hooked into Maria's heart, pulling her down into the abyss. It wasn't the first time. She realized this wasn't a random kidnapping. It wasn't a lone psychopath. It was a system. A line, a machine that was crushing little, voiceless children. Maria crouched down, her hand tightening on the phone. She pressed record, bringing the camera close to the crack in the door and capturing the man's face. Even though he was bowed, some angles were clear enough. She pressed record, even as her heart felt like it was about to burst. She had to act. But how? Call the authorities. She pulled out her phone, dialed 911, then paused. If she called from here, the voice of the operator, or even the ringing of the phone, might alert the man. She needed to find a safer place. She backed up a few steps, trying not to make a sound, and found her car. As soon as she was out of sight of the house, Maria called 911. 911. What's your emergency? Her voice was shaky but firm. My name is Maria Flores. I'm near Old Mill Road. North of Oakdale. I've just observed a man posing as a parent kidnapping my student. She's tied up in an abandoned house, and I believe this is human trafficking. I have photos, audio, and GPS. She spoke quickly, as if Lily's fear was powering her. The operator asked for her location. Maria immediately sent a GPS ping and transmitted whatever evidence she had. We've sent a task force. Keep your distance. And don't go it alone, Miss Flores. Maria hung up, but her heart was pounding. Lily was still tied up, still sitting there, and the man was about to leave. She looked toward the house. Inside, the man was packing a few things into a backpack, checking his phone, and heading out the back door. Maybe he was about to leave. Maybe he was taking Lily somewhere else. The police wouldn't arrive in time if she didn't stall for time. She knew she was about to do something dangerous, but the look in Lily's eyes just now made it impossible for her to turn away. Maria pulled out the iron pen from her bag, the one she used to take notes in her student notebook. Then she picked up a small rock and threw it at the old iron gate about 10 meters away from the house, making a clear clang. The man inside stopped. He turned his head, walked quickly onto the porch, his eyes looking around, the flashlight in his hands sweeping over the bushes. Maria hid behind a pile of rubble, holding her breath. After a few seconds, he turned on his phone light and walked toward the sound. Maria took the opportunity to cross the backyard, climbing over the broken windowsill into the house. The cold wind blew in her face, carrying the smell of dust and metal. Lily was still sitting there, her whole body trembling. The girl saw her, her eyes wide with surprise and hope. Maria walked over quickly and whispered, "I'm here. It's okay. I'll get you out." She pulled out a paper cutter from her pen and cut the rope around Lily's wrists. Then she slowly removed the tape from her mouth. Lily burst into tears immediately. Trying to hold back her sobs, Maria hugged her and whispered, "Hush, just a little longer. The police are coming." Footsteps sounded behind her. Maria turned around. The man was back. His eyes flashed with surprise, then turned to fury. "Who are you?" Maria pulled Lily to her feet, blocking her way. Nothing in his hands, only his instincts as an adult to protect a child. But before he could take another step, a police siren blared through the night air. Red and blue lights flashed in the distance. Windows flashed, radios blared. The police were closing in. The man tried to turn and run out the back door, but an officer was there tackling him to the floor. He struggled, cursing, but seconds later, his hands were cuffed behind his back. A female officer ran over, scooped Lily up, and held her shivering in the emergency blanket. Maria sank to the ground, her arms still around Lily, her body drenched in sweat and tears. She hadn't let Lily go, and now she no longer doubted her instincts. The sirens echoed through the night like a wake-up call. But for Maria, every second was a battle. Even though the police were closing in, She knew if the man got Lily out of the house before they did, things could spiral out of control forever. After recording and sending the evidence, Maria quickly bought time. She snapped a few more photos close-ups of the man's face, Lily's bindings, even the license plate of the SUV parked in front of the house. She sent them all to the operator, along with the current coordinates. They responded quickly. Patrol is on the scene. Just keep a safe distance. Safe. Maria looked at the small window where Lily was still tied. Her little shoulders were shaking. The safe they were talking about was minutes away, but she didn't have minutes left. She knew she had to do something now. Maria scanned the area. The house had a back door, lit by a bare bulb hanging loosely. Inside, the man was still pacing inside, talking on the phone, apparently checking the time and the money. Don't be late like last time. I won't keep her for more than an hour. Maria shivered. She bent down, picked up a small rock from her feet, and aimed it lightly at the corner of the house, opposite a pile of rusted metal and old beer cans. She threw it hard. Knock. The sound rang out, deafening, echoing through the silence. Inside, the man was instantly startled. What? He muttered and walked out the back door, flashlight in hand, his gaze scanning the darkness between the bushes and the trash. Maria held her breath, counting the seconds. When the footsteps faded, she crossed the yard and slipped through the open back door. The house smelled of old dust and rotten wood. The ceiling light flickered, creating nightmarish flickering light and dark. Lily was still sitting there. She flinched when she heard the noise, but when she recognized Maria, her eyes lit up. Tears welled up. Miss Flores, those eyes whispered. Maria didn't hesitate. She pulled a small knife from her notepad and quickly cut the ropes. Lily winced as the rope around her wrists was removed, but she didn't make a sound. Maria gently peeled the tape from her mouth. You're here. I'm safe. The words rang out like a talisman. Lily immediately burst into tears, her small body throwing itself into Maria's arms. Auntie, I was so scared. I thought no one would see me. Maria tightened her arms around her, her eyes brimming with tears, but her voice calm. She said, It's okay. I'm not leaving you. But they didn't have much time. Maria knew that. She quickly pulled Lily to her feet and whispered in her ear, We have to get out of here. The police will be here soon, but we have to get out first. They crept along the rotten wooden hallway, avoiding the light. Maria heard the man's footsteps, returning the soft bang of the back door, and a suspicious murmur. That's strange, ... It must be a weasel. But then he stopped. What? ... What? His voice suddenly became harsh. He realized Lily was no longer where she was. Maria grabbed Lily's hand and whispered, Run. They dashed toward the front door. The half-opened rotten wooden door was the only way out, but his footsteps thundered behind them. He spotted them. Stop, he shouted, like a storm of anger. They rushed out the door just as he lunged at them, his hand almost touching Lily's shoulder. Maria pushed the door open, then used all her strength to push back a wooden board, blocking the exit. Buying precious seconds, they ran across the yard, into the tall grass ahead. Maria's breath was ragged. Her heart felt like it was about to explode. Lily gasped, her little feet tangled in the grass but still clinging to her. Behind her, the man roared angrily. Then his footsteps slowed. The flashlight scanned the darkness, unsteadily, and then the siren sounded. From the end of the path, flashing red and blue lights appeared, shining directly at the abandoned house. 4 police cars rushed in, officers jumping out of them, weapons. Ready? A rapid response helicopter roared into the night sky. Police here. Drop your weapons. Hands up. The man froze in the backyard with no way out. But within seconds, he was tackled to the ground by 2 officers. his hands tied behind his back. He cursed and screamed, but no one paid any attention. Maria and Lily were picked up by a female officer who pulled an emergency blanket over her shoulders. Lily cowered but held Maria tight. Another officer stepped forward, speaking softly. "We have the audio and video. You saved her life. Do you know that?" Maria nodded. She leaned down, kissed Lily lightly on the forehead, and whispered, "She was never alone. You heard what others didn't see." In the flashing lights of the police car, Maria stood there, her face weary, but her eyes brighter than ever. For this time, she had been right to trust her instincts. And this time, a child had come back from the edge of the abyss. A soft sound behind her made Maria turn. The man had turned. For a brief moment, his eyes met hers, shock, rage, and animal instinct, all at once. Without a word, he lunged. Maria grabbed Lily's hand and ran toward the wooden stairs at the back of the house. They passed the cobwebbed kitchen, where every chair and every cupboard was tilted and rotted. Each step made a terrifying creaking sound, but she had no choice. Behind her, the man's footsteps followed, the sound of broken wood, like a hammer, hitting her brain. There were only a few steps left to go up the stairs. Lily trembled, almost falling when her foot slipped on the mold. Maria pulled her up in time, pushed her up, and then rushed after her. Their breathing was rapid, each step tearing the air apart. The smell of mold, old paint, and the cold from the broken doors mixed together, making the space even more stifling. Above her head, the rickety ceilings seemed to sway with each step,